They say the desert remembers every footstep it buries. It forgets nothing, only hides the past beneath a shifting skin. Tonight, the dunes are restless, the stars are unblinking, and a rider sits on a ridge of stone, facing a city the color of old bread. His name is the lost king of the desert. Once he had another name, a name that summoned tents from horizon to horizon, a name sung by nightingales that learned to sing from human mouths. He is 30 years old in his bones, but his eyes are older, as if two constellations were shot down and trapped behind his lashes. Beside him stands a black horse, the kind of darkness that swallows a fire and returns it as a gleam along the mane. The horse is patient with a patience learned from wind and distance. The king lays a palm on its neck. Heat meets heat. There is a city below, mud, brick, and memory. Its alleys are the narrow arteries of a sleeping heart. Its rooftops are the backs of sun-baked turtles. Its lamps are late thoughts. He can see from this height how the city once wore garlands of smoke, and how drums used to speak in its courtyards, and how the market lifted its laughter like a bowl of citrus. He can see what is no longer there. The city wears absence like a veil. Father, he whispers, though his father is wind. Mother, he says, though his mother is dust. Beloved, he says, though his beloved is the horizon itself, forever retreating, forever near. A voice answers him, not from below, not from behind, but from the place where speech becomes breath and breath becomes silence. Do you remember, my son? The voice asks. I remember everything, he says. Tell it to me then. Tell it to the sand, which pretends to forget. Tell it to the night, which pretends not to listen. So the lost king begins. And because he has ridden so long with nothing but the sky for a roof, he tells it in a voice that has kept company with starlight. Once there was a boy born in a tent that moved with the seasons. The tent spoke every language the desert taught it. The whisper of stretched wool in a dust-strong wind, the hush of camel hide at dawn, the litany of brass rings tapping one another like small bells. The boy's mother sang in the mornings. The boy's father recited at night. The boy learned the taste of words on his tongue before he knew the taste of bread. He learned also the continence of silence. A father pausing after a line to weigh the next line. A mother stopping mid-song to listen for the approach of hooves. The hush when a hawk shadow passed over the goats, and their bells ceased. He grew as children do, by scandalous inches, and so did his shadow, until he began to race it at sunset and win. The elders laughed then, not knowing they were a plotting their own vanishing. The boy would be man. The man would be king. The king would be lost. There was a girl, the kind of girl the desert makes to test a poet. Her laughter was a shawl she wore even in the heat. Her hands were two birds that never forgot to return. She plaited her hair with thin threads of gold, not to show wealth, but to admit light. Her name can be said only by a mouth that has tasted both honey and salt. When the boy learned it, he said it once, then kept it in the room inside the heart, where winter goes to warm itself. The tents multiplied like truths. The boy's father drew lines in sand and called them boundaries. The boy's mother sowed sweet dates in the eyes of children and called them patience. The boy stood at the center of the clan like a single tall reed around, which the river of tribe learned to bend. Raiders came, and he rode against them. Drought came, and he rode seeking a cloud as if chasing a white gazelle. He returned with a storm behind him like a rumor. He returned with poems in his pockets like coins. When the elders made him king, they did not do it with a crown at first. They did it with a circle. They stood in a ring, and the space inside the ring was a throne of air. The boy stepped there and spoke not of power, but of water, not of enemies, but of thirst. Let us be generous, he said, the way palm trees are generous, giving away shade to strangers, dates to birds, stories to fires. They crowned him later with a circlet of brass, plain as a cup. The plainness made it heavy. It was then he took the city below, not with iron, but with invitation. The gates opened to him, not because they feared his horse, but because the city remembered its own first name. There were weddings. The bazaar found music it had forgotten it owned. The king wrote new laws with a reed pen, which stained his fingers green, and his hand looked like a leaf learning how to be an alphabet. And love, he married the girl whose hair was a festival of gold. They made a home of overlapping shadows and sun, framed by walls that smelled of wet clay after rain. Sometimes in the evening she would sit with a bowl of pomegranates in her lap and split them open with a nail, and the seeds would gleam like rubies cut from laughter. The king would say lines and forget to finish them because her mouth had taught him the better word. But the desert does not remain silent long. It listens for the proud, the tender, the lucky, and brings them a lesson. The messengers came at night, men with dust in their eyebrows who had outpaced their shadows. Your uncle, they said, has gathered a tide of iron. He says the city was promised to him by a treaty written in the mouth of a dying scribe. He says the tents have forgotten their traveling. He says the crown fits his skull better than yours fits your conscience. The king laughed once, not from joy. Then he did a thing kings rarely do. He sent gifts: a white camel, a sword whose hilt was wrapped for the width of 2 palms, a bowl of salt, a poem which said, "Uncle, the desert is wider than any crown, but narrower than love. Come and eat dates in the courtyard. Bring your quarrel. We will bury it under a fig tree." The uncle sent back carrion birds, 3 dark letters that cut the air. He came with a storm of spears like a field that had forgotten it was once a garden. And there was battle then, not the kind sung by boys around a fire, but the kind the earth endures with clenched teeth. The king fought until his arms were 2 pious prayers. He fought until his horse became a river he crossed and recrossed. He fought until his name became an ache in the city's throat. He lost. No one loses like a king. When a king loses, every grain of sand stands up and declares itself a witness. He fled, which is another way to say he remembered how to move. With him went a handful of loyal men. His old teacher, who carried a book pressed to his chest as if it were an infant, and the black horse, who had eaten smoke and discovered it tasted like iron. He could not bring his beloved. The palace had become a fishbone in the uncle's throat. Guards prowled its corridors like dogs arguing with their tails. The king sent a single message, a piece of linen on which he drew a mountain and the thin crescent of a moon above it. She knew the meaning. I am where the moon sharpens itself to a blade. She wore that linen around her wrist and waited until waiting itself grew old and put on spectacles. Exile is a nation with no borders, only distances. The king learned the map of distances the way a blind man learns a stranger's face. He learned the grammar of thirst, the how, the when, the why. He sat by stranger fires and said not his name. He traded rings for bread. He held his cloak up against a wind that recited his lineage and still found it wanting. There were nights when he slept inside the shadow of a single shrub, and mornings when he woke to find that shadow had walked away. He talked to his horse. The horse answered with the honesty of a creature that has never lied to itself. "Will we go back?" he asked. The horse pawed the sand and made a small valley. Yes, it said, in the speech of whose. He met people on the road, as all roads are composed of people. A woman who had lost her eyes to the mirror's cruelty, but found them again inside the jug she lifted for strangers. A child who spoke only in questions and thus became a prophet. A smith who mended swords until he learned to mend voices. Each gave the king a gift that could not be worn: patience, curiosity, the sound a heart makes when it forgives. He gathered these invisible gifts and carried them like water. He began to sing not the songs of victory, but the songs of continuation. He learned that survival is a music whose first instrument is the throat and whose last is the silence after a note refuses to die. Word of him traveled even when he did not. In caravans, they spoke of the king who had lost his city but not his measures, the king who bought bread with poems and salt with apologies, the king who taught children to count stars with their fingers and then spend them wisely. Stories are coins that mint themselves. His uncle could not spend them all. There came a day when the king reached the mountain drawn on linen. Its sides were steep, cut by old rivers that had fled before the sun. He climbed with hands that remembered hilt and rein, but had to relearn stone. The horse carried him where the carrying became dangerous, and then stood at the edge of his own fear and would not move. Even courage returns to the stable when the cliffs begin to ask riddles. At the peak, the world became honest. A single circle of horizon, a single lung of wind. Below, his city, which had learned new shadows. He watched the alleys arrange themselves like lines waiting for a poet. He watched the palace, his, but not his, the way a scar is his, but belongs also to the knife. He spoke then, not to the wind, which has heard too much, but to the part of himself that still wore the circlet of plain brass. King, he told himself, as if the word had shifted, as if king were as much a verb as a crown. King, what do you seek? Not return, he answered himself, surprised. Not revenge. He sought a thing harder, the right distance, the distance at which love becomes possible again. He descended at dusk. The mountain made him a smaller man, which is to say a larger human. At the foot, his horse waited, head turned, the moon hanging from his eye like a tear made of metal. Friend, said the king, tonight we travel like shadows wearing the skin of men. He twisted the reins into the language of stealth. They moved down among the thorn bushes, along the terraces where figs dream, across dry streams whose stones remembered rain. He reached the city's outskirts, where goats carry secrets in their bells, and cats pretend ownership of doorways. He entered the city as one enters prayer, across a threshold, head bowed, lips already forming a word that might redeem a day. He saw his own face reflected in copper plates hung outside a smithy to cool, and he saw a stranger, harder, thinner, with eyes that had learned to look over and through and remember to return. Children watched him with the insolence of the unbruised. A woman selling bread glanced once, and then twice. The second looked the little sister of recognition. You, she said, but the rest of the sentence was arrested by caution and duty and a small, unspendable joy. She put an extra piece of bread in his bag and would not take coin. The old teacher emerged from a crowd like a word disappearing from a page and then reappearing, brighter. His book, still pressed to his chest, had grown a spine like a palm tree's. "My king," said the teacher. "Hush," said the king. "Tonight I am only a man who needs to borrow a doorway." The teacher led him through alleys that had missed his footsteps the way a family misses the smallest spoon. They went to a courtyard where a fig tree had grown into itself and made a ceiling. A lamp burned there, low, patient, and there, his beloved. Time is a beast with two natures. In the space between one look and the next, it stood on all fours and then flew. He saw her as if she had stepped out of a jar where someone had stored a summer. Her hair was longer, and she wore the linen at her wrist, now the color of moonlight washed by too much waiting. She rose, and the room rose, and the lamp made a circle around the two of them and called it enough. When she spoke his name, the city remembered its first language. When he spoke hers, the city forgave every wall it had built. They did not run to each other. They arrived. He placed his palm against her cheek and told her, without words, about the mountains and the children and the smith and the bread that names itself bread. She touched his beard and told him, without words, about legends that had become chores and how she had learned to move her prayers from dawn to dusk depending on the uncle's soldier's mood. "Come with me," he said, though the word with trembled. "Not to flee," he added, "but to begin." "Begin what?" she asked. "Your question is the beginning," he said. They planned then, not war, but a garden you can carry. They made a small bundle of books that refuse to forget their readers, of dates that store their own sunlight, of water that had learned to wait inside goatskins like a well in a traveler's ribs. They left at moon's rising. The teacher went with them, because knowledge loves to leave when it is told it cannot. The horse came, soft-footed, head low. They crossed the sleeping city. The palace watched them go the way thundercloud watches a lone bird, with surprise at the audacity of small freedom. At the gate, a guard turned away as if called by an invisible voice. Another stared hard at the horse's hooves as if deciphering a script of departure only animals can write. They entered the desert. Exile in company becomes pilgrimage. They traveled by night, slept by day, and braided their thirst so that each could drink what the other had refused to surrender. The beloved told stories of the city that were not lament but inventory. The smell of coriander under wet mortar, The way laughter echoes between two tall walls and becomes taller. The call of sellers at morning that makes the air feel like a shawl hung with coins. The teacher recited names of stars as if introducing old friends. The horse taught them the meaning of pace. The king listened. Listening is how a king becomes a shepherd. Days accumulated. The desert tested and taught, punished and praised. There was a morning when a sandstorm came with the suddenness of regret. They wrapped their heads in cloth and leaned into nothingness made visible. The teacher, thin and stubborn, set himself like a nail in a board. The beloved stood with her back to the wind and shielded the lamp they carried inside their joined hands, the lamp of not giving up. The king laughed, a wild laugh that does not ask permission. Why? She asked. I slitted, teeth catching grains of the ancient sea. Because, he said, even this is praise. And the storm, embarrassed by the compliment, moved on. They reached an oasis that was more memory than water. Palm trunks leaned like old men discussing weather. The surface of the pool wore a skin of dust the color of time. They stepped into shade with a gratitude that made sound. They drank and did not taste only wetness. They drank instructions. That night, they built a fire, and the fire told them 3 truths. First, that every burning is also a liturgy. Second, that light, like love, is a verb that makes objects honest. Third, that ash is not ending, but preparation. They slept as if sleep were a culture. They were learning. The king dreamt of a city rebuilt from inside out, where doors grew into themselves until they realized they were gates. The beloved dreamt of a garden with no fence, where the figs fell into open hands that were not begging but welcoming. The teacher dreamt of a page that wrote on him. Morning arrived with a patience that resembles mercy. They continued, bearing south and then west, then giving up on compass and following the path a hawk drew on the air. They met men from tribes the king's father had fought, and women from clans his mother had fed. They met a caravan of salt that glittered like hoarded dawn. They bought nothing, sold nothing, traded only stories. At the edge of a gravel plain that rang under hoof like a drumhead, they saw it, a ruined city, dead long before their living, walls broken to the height of a man's promise, columns that stood belly deep in sand, a gate with nothing to keep out. The beloved laid her palm on the stone and felt a quiver, the lingering of festivals gone quiet. The king walked its streets and listened. The teacher knelt and brushed dust off an inscription that flinched, then smiled. Listen, said the teacher, fingers dirty with letters. It says, We are a people who built to endure. We forgot to endure. The king stood where a palace had been. He closed his eyes and saw a shadow of a throne, and on it a man with his face, but crueler. A man who had turned water into mirrors and asked everyone to drink. "Let us not build that city," he said softly. "What then shall we build?" asked the beloved. "A way," he said, "a way that others can walk without asking permission." They left the ruin as one leaves a cautionary tale, grateful and unburdened, weeks folded like tents. The king's beard grew the way a story grows when it learns the right listener. The beloved's eyes sharpened until they could thread a camel through a needle. The teacher's back bent into a bough from which wisdom flew. One evening, as the sky practiced being purple, they met a stranger. The stranger wore a robe the color of sand after rain and a smile learned from dates. He walked without casting a shadow, which is disconcerting unless you have learned not to trust easy marvels. He joined their fire as if returning to a seat just vacated. No one asked his name. Names are sometimes the least interesting thing. They spoke as travelers speak, about water first, then distance, then the weather inside them. The stranger listened as if building a house from their sentences. When he finally spoke, it was to ask a question that had no roof. "What do you see?" The king answered with the honesty of a man whose lies have left him like impatient guests. "A beginning that makes our ending unnecessary," he said. The stranger nodded as